Hello friends! Today I'm going to be talking about peer review. This video will be primarily aimed at undergraduates and postgraduates rather than early career folks looking at publishing their own work. Peer review is, as the name suggests, the review of scholarly work by a body of the author's peers. The purpose of peer review is manifold, but I think it's important to point out right at the start that peer review is not fact-checking, and it's not about saying that a piece of work is the definitive word in that subject. You are allowed to disagree with work that's been peer-reviewed. In a very, very simplified way, because there'll be another video discussing this process in much more detail soon, the process goes something like this. Author writes a piece of scholarship, whether a book, a chapter, an article, or something similar, and sends it to an editor. The editor is not a person who edits individual pieces of work, who is actually a copy editor, but a person who edits a journal or the list at an academic press or another scholar who's putting together an edited collection. The editor then reads the piece of work and either issues a desk reject or flat-out rejection based only on this reading. This might be because the work has a serious flaw or because the editor doesn't think the work will fit within their journal, book, or list of books. Otherwise, the editor will send the work out to peer reviewers. The number depends on the journal or press, but it's often two. The reviewers then read the work and provide feedback, including a recommendation to the editor about whether the work should be published as is, published after revisions, or not published. The editor collates and edits the reviews and sends them to the author along with the decision. If it's a straight accept, then hooray, the piece is published. If it's a revise and resubmit, the author is given a set amount of time to complete the revisions before resubmission, after which the piece may be accepted or may be sent back to reviewers. And if it's a rejection, then the author makes a decision about what to do with the piece of feedback they've received. But what does all this mean for you when you're sitting down to write your essays? It means that you can trust that work that's undergone peer review has been rigorously read and other scholars have agreed that the work is worth publishing. This doesn't necessarily mean that the work is correct, although there is some simple fact-checking that goes along with peer review. This is also constrained by the knowledge of the reviewers themselves. And it doesn't mean that the reviewer necessarily agrees with the conclusions presented in the work. But it does mean that you can trust that the piece of scholarship is valid to use in your own work. Just going back to reviewers agreeing with conclusions for a moment. The point of peer review isn't to create a coherent body of literature. The point is that the fundamental premise of a piece of scholarship is correct, and there aren't any glaring errors in data or other information, that there hasn't been any kind of ethical breach or anything like that, and just to make sure that it's all laid out and explained in a way that makes sense and contributes to the overall discussion of the field. Another point of order here. There are loads of great books, articles, news, videos, podcasts, and other new media that might be exactly what you need. What do you do if these things haven't been peer reviewed? Does it mean you can't use them? Nope. Of course you can. In my forthcoming book, I cite both a podcast and Wikipedia. Depending on your field, you might rely on, for example, news reporting or government reports or court testimony. Peer review is just one tool to use in assessing whether something is a valid source. The next question I'm sure you're wondering is this. How do you tell if something has been peer reviewed or not? Well, thankfully that's actually pretty easy with the power of your brain and Google when you're a bit stuck. To start, anything written by a university press, so Cambridge University Press, Oxford University Press, Princeton University Press, you get the general gist, that's of an academic nature has definitely been peer reviewed. Likewise, anything on an academic list of a trade press, so Routledge, Bloomsbury, IB Tauris, Polity, these kinds of places. If you don't know, the easiest way to find out is by searching the name of the press and instructions for authors or peer review policy. As the name suggests, the instructions for authors will take you to the list of instructions for people who want to submit their manuscripts to that press. So there'll be loads of things on there that don't concern you. But if you search for review or peer review, you'll often find mention of it. That goes from monographs, which are usually single-authored or joint-authored books, and edited collections. Journals are slightly different, but the same sort of principle. If they're academic journals that you find either in your university library from reading lists you've been set, or on databases like JSTOR, Project Muse, or PubMed, then they're more than likely peer-reviewed. If you don't know, again, search for the journal name and instructions for authors or peer review policy. Also have a look at the editor of the journal. If they're an academic, then the journal is more than likely peer-reviewed. Of course, this doesn't go for some disciplines that don't lend themselves to review in the same kind of way, like creative writing or art practice, though not academic writing about creative writing or art history. But once you get the hang of reading scholarly work, you honestly won't need to search journals and presses to find out if they're peer-reviewed. You'll just have an idea. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about why it's important that you use scholarship in your own work. There are some pretty basic reasons for it. It helps you situate your ideas and your understanding of the field. It means you don't have to explain everything you reference in detail. That is, you can say, as so-and-so has demonstrated, instead of having to waste your words showing that yourself. It helps you substantiate your opinions. But for students, the number one reason that you should use scholarship in your assignments is because it demonstrates that you have critically engaged with your work and that you have interrogated your own ideas and where they fit within your field. I think this comes down to students considering themselves as apprentice scholars right from the start. You should be approaching your first essay and first year in this way. And to do that, you need to show that you're engaged and tapped in, and citing other scholars does that. Of course, on a very practical level, it's also because you want to get a good mark, and the people who mark your assignments probably will want you to demonstrate that you've read some stuff that they've suggested, and also that you maybe have gone away and looked for some other stuff on your own. Okay, that's it for the basics of peer review. I've got some other assignment writing videos in the works, but if there's anything you'd particularly like to see, please let me know. Have a lovely day. Thanks for watching. Bye.